Hi, welcome to my next video. This time, finally, I have for you the last part in the series in which I was making illustrations and the cover for the DoCoMo 2021 calendar. And this is the last video in this series in which I'm making the cover for the whole thing. To all of you who stuck with this series and saw all the episodes, thank you. This is the last one and the biggest picture that I did in this whole series. The whole thing was really challenging, really difficult in many ways, but I'm glad that I finished all the pictures, even though that they were one of the difficult and most challenging and most time consuming and energy consuming pictures that I did recently, especially if I think about digital painting. I did a lot of hand-painted works, especially in my Tokyo at Night book, and some other big format watercolors or color ink paintings that were challenging and required a lot of focus and concentration not to make any mistakes. But these digital illustrations were a bit different than that because they required more resilience, I think, and just working hard on the effect and putting a lot of time and effort to make all the pieces look good. And this is also because there were two aspects of these illustrations that were really difficult to realize correctly. The first was that all the places that I painted here in this series were real places. So they had to be portrayed in a way that if you look at the picture and you know the place, you will recognize it on the illustration, you will recognize it on the picture. So all the places that were known or symbolic or well known in Japan had to be painted in this realistic way so they can be recognized, and you can easily say, oh, this is Shirakawa or this is the Kiyomizu temple in Kyoto or whatever if you see the illustration. But at the same time, all the illustrations had to be painterly enough and creative enough, and you should be able to see that actually these are painted pictures and not photos, because, well, there would be no sense in me doing these pictures if you could just go and take a photo of this location. So there had to be this delicate balance between realism, keeping the thing realistic enough, and at the same time making it painterly enough so there is the meaning in me doing these illustrations at all. At the same time, I was asked when I was given this commission to paint in a style that is more straight, is more realistic, is more to the point. So something similar to what we can see in animation movies recently, the background of animated movies. So I had to stay safe from going back to the things that I remembered from when I was in the animation studio. So I would not start painting in the animation studio style because that's their style of painting and not my style of painting. But I also couldn't just go like full tilt my digital painting style with all the wonky buildings and weird perspective and loose lines, something that I really like to do when painting digitally, especially because that's not just something the client wanted. So even though I had a lot of creative freedom while doing these pieces, they had the idea of a style that they wanted to have on their illustrations, and fair enough, this is their commission. So I had to do this balancing act between the realism of all these scenes and painterliness, so there is meaning in me doing these illustrations, and the anime kind of background style of painting, but not too much because it would be too similar to the works that I did in the animation studio, and not going full tilt into my own digital loose painting style. So making these illustrations proved to be more difficult in a way than I expected from the stylistic point also. The second thing that was difficult, of course, was that all these digital illustrations were made for print. Usually when I make illustrations, I make them by hand with watercolors or pencils. Then I can just scan them in high resolution and I don't have to worry about making the files big, because when I just scan them in 600 dpi or something like that, the final files will be big enough for me to use them in a book or even on a poster. But here I had to paint on a file that is big enough, high enough resolution that it can be printed in good quality on a big calendar. And this proved to be a bit difficult, especially that I was using the iPad Pro of the older generation then, so I had less layers and the iPad was a bit slower, so I had to use some tricks to make this work. All the illustrations in this series were made in files that were wider than 6,000 pixels, so really quite big, especially when you think that all the backgrounds for animation movies that we did when I was working in the animation studio were just full HD size, just a bit bigger for wiggle room to be able to move them around if necessary. And here I was doing files that were 3 times wider and 3 times taller on an iPad. So it was difficult at times. At the same time, because the file was so big and so high resolution, it just gets so easy to get bogged down in details. It gets so easy to zoom in and just paint infinite details in the file. And in some of the images, I actually had to stop myself because I made them too detailed. It was difficult to just stop myself and stop adding details. This is because in digital files, and especially such high resolution files, I always have this fear that the picture will be bare if I don't put enough details. You'll be able to see the digital brush touches there on the wall when it will be printed, and I always have this tendency to add too many details and just zoom in and add details until the picture is full, even though I know that it's not good for the actual painterliness of the picture and the style of the picture. It's hard to do the balancing act between details and digital brush touches, the style in such huge resolution files also. Apart from content and style problems, such big files pose also technical difficulties. Mostly the limit of how many layers I could have in the files in Procreate and how the brushes work on so big files and so on. So for example, for this biggest illustration that I did for this project, I chose to split the file into 2. So I painted the city and the sky on separate files to have more layers to work with. This was a very neat solution for the problem, especially that the final file would end up being more than 7,500 pixels high. So that was a big file indeed. But once I finished both the parts on the iPad, I was able to combine the file in Photoshop on my computer, add some filters, do some color correction, and the final illustration was ready. Of course, that wasn't the end of this project. There was still the print. I had to look at a lot of test prints and correct some colors and look at more test prints and correct the colors even more. Of course, it's very easy to paint with nice saturated colors with our great screens on our iPads and computers, and then it's really difficult to print these colors accurately, and sometimes it's impossible. In the end, after many adjustments, the printing company was able to print something that looked really close to what I wanted to show with my illustrations, so it was great to see the final results on paper too. Okay, this picture is nearly finished. I will show you the result in a second. It was really interesting to finish this series with a view of the Tokyo skyline with the Shinjuku buildings there in the distance, and of course there's also the DoCoMo tower on the left, so the headquarters of the company which actually commissioned me to do this series of illustrations. It was also very interesting for me to go through the process of creating all the illustrations, to review it, to probe a little into what I was thinking and what I was aiming for while making all these illustrations and see if I managed to achieve these goals. I think that by making all these illustrations, but also by making all the videos and reviewing them many times, I learned a lot. And I also hope, of course, that you enjoyed watching them and maybe took something from them too. Okay, that's it for this video and that's it for this series. As always, feel free to comment, share and subscribe, and you can also support me on Patreon. It's your support there that allows me to spend time making these videos. See you in the next one. Bye!